It is the 12th of December, 1911. In Coronation Park in Delhi, an estimated 500,000 people have gathered to see the display of pageantry and power that is the Delhi Durbar. The event is being held to mark the accession of the King of Great Britain and Emperor of India, George V, the latter being a title only created by the British government in 1877. Standing by the King Emperor's side is the new Queen of Great Britain and Empress of India, a woman who will help guide the British throne through numerous crises, including 2 world wars and the eventual setting of the sun over Britain's imperial era. Her name? Mary of Teck, Matriarch of the House of Windsor. The woman known to history as Mary of Teck, Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, was born on the 26th of May, 1867, in Kensington Palace in London. She was born in the same room that Queen Victoria, the reigning monarch of Britain at the time, had been born in 48 years earlier. Members of Europe's royal families and leading aristocratic lineages had extremely long names by the 19th century. Mary's full baptismal name was Victoria Mary Augusta Louise Olga Pauline Claudine Agnes. She went by the name Victoria Mary in her younger years and later Mary as Queen, though her family and friends knew her simply as May. Mary's father was Prince Francis, Duke of Teck, an aristocratic title deriving from the Swabia region of Germany. He was the son of Alexander, Duke of Württemberg, and so Mary was of strong German heritage despite her birth in London. This was something she shared with both sides of her family. The British royals were effectively a German lineage, albeit descended as well from the Welsh Tudors, the Scottish Stuarts, and, if one looked far enough back, the Anglo-Norman kings of late medieval England. Mary's mother was the Princess Mary Adelaide, a daughter of Prince Adolphus, Duke of Cambridge. He was, in turn, the son of King George III, who had ruled Britain from 1760 to 1820. Thus, little Mary, who was born at Kensington Palace in 1867, was a great-granddaughter of King George III, an era-defining monarch in his own right. All of this meant that Mary was the first cousin of Queen Victoria, the ruler of Britain since 1837. Her parents had only married in 1866, and Mary was their first child. She would remain their only daughter, though 3 boys would follow in due course. These were Adolphus Jr., after his maternal grandfather, born in 1868, Francis, born in 1870, and Alexander, born in 1874. All 4 children would live into their adult years. Mary was born at a time when the world was changing at a rate that was unprecedented in human history. The scale of this change would have an impact on her life, as the world she was born into in 1867 was very different from the one she lived much of her long adult life in. Britain had already changed enormously in the century prior to her arrival into the world. The Industrial Revolution had begun almost exactly 100 years prior to her birth. It began to transform England from an agricultural, rural society into a country of growing cities centred on factories and tenements. In the 1830s, industrialists began connecting these cities with the new railway lines. In 1851, the Great Exhibition took place in the Crystal Palace in London, showcasing the ways in which new inventions were appearing that would transform the world and which demonstrated humanity's growing mastery over science and nature. By then, the Industrial Revolution was spreading speedily to countries like Belgium, Germany, France, and the United States. Soon, the Second Industrial Revolution would begin. Mary grew up as this was occurring, and her childhood years would be lived against the backdrop of electrification being introduced, while innovations like the camera and the telegraph had become commonplace by the 1870s. Soon, the first automobiles and radios would follow. When Mary was growing up in the 1870s, London was a city of gas and oil lamps and horses. By the time she was middle-aged, it was a metropolis where automobiles and electric street lighting prevailed. It was also an era of democratization. When Queen Victoria was born back in 1819, the United Kingdom was effectively a plutocracy, where only men of a certain wealth or status were allowed to vote. In Mary's lifetime, it would become a full democracy, where all adults were allowed to vote. In tandem, the position of the royal family changed considerably in ways which would be central to how Mary lived her life. On the surface, Mary's childhood should have been one of privilege. She was a member of the royal family, albeit not of a line that was directly placed in the succession. There was no possibility that she or her brothers would succeed to the throne one day. This aside, they should have been afforded a comfortable upbringing on account of their status as cousins of the Queen, and also their father's position as a leading German prince. The reality was quite different. Mary's father had not come to England with a large income from his German estate, and even though Mary's mother was given an annual parliamentary subsidy of £5,000, a sizable enough sum in Victorian times, they spent well beyond their means. In fairness to her parents, a lot of their financial difficulties were because they were simply expected to spend money on official ceremonies and gatherings, and on maintaining a large household of staff at Kensington Palace, and their other home at the White Lodge at Windsor. The upshot of this for Mary was that her parents tried not to spend too much money on her education and upbringing. Her governess was an Alsatian woman named Helena Bricker, who she became close to. Mary spent a large amount of time with her mother in her youth, and acquired from her a tendency towards charity and care for the poor. When she was 16, Mary was sent to Florence, in Italy, and spent 18 months in the home of the Renaissance. Between her time there and her studies when she returned home, she learned to speak Italian, French, and German, and became interested in literature and art history. As she became a young woman, people at the court referred to her as shy and interested more in reading than royal ceremonies, but of a kind disposition. As with any daughter of a royal or high aristocratic family in early modern times and into the 19th century, the issue of who Mary would marry arose from an early age. She was in a peculiar position. As a cousin of Queen Victoria and a member of the wider royal family, it was assumed that she could not marry a commoner or below her station. At the same time, she was not highly enough placed within the royal family that her parents could hope to arrange a marriage with one of the leading heirs of Europe's royal houses. It was therefore assumed that she would marry a second or third son of some minor royal house, and would assume the position of a duchess or some other high aristocratic title in one European country or another. However, her first cousin had other ideas. Queen Victoria was not as concerned about who her family members should or shouldn't marry as many others were, and so she formed the idea for an unconventional match. Mary would marry Victoria's own grandson, Albert Victor. He was the eldest son of Victoria's heir, the future King Edward VII. Albert Victor was a wayward young man who had refused to marry, ignored royal protocol on several matters, and who had been involved in a controversy in 1889, where he was rumoured to have visited a brothel for gay men on Cleveland Street in London. There have even been historians who try to claim that Albert Victor was actually Jack the Ripper, the notorious serial killer of late Victorian London. None of these claims have ever been proven in any way. What is clear is that Victoria thought Mary might help her grandson to settle down and decided they would marry. It never happened, though. Before the marriage went ahead, Albert Victor died in January 1892 of pneumonia brought on by the so-called Asian flu pandemic. Observers at the time noted that Mary was deeply upset by Albert Victor's death and the collapse of the marriage plans. In the end, her marriage to the second in line to the throne would go ahead anyway. It was just that the prince in question changed. With Albert Victor's death, his younger brother, George Frederick, became the second in line. He was made Duke of York in May 1892 to signal his advanced position in the succession. Just over a year later, on the 6th of July 1893, he and Mary were married at St. James's Palace. The marriage began under inauspicious circumstances. George had fallen in love with Julie Stoner, a daughter of one of his mother's ladies-in-waiting, but it was made clear to him that a second in line to the throne, marriage to a commoner, was completely out of the question. Instead, George married Mary. This was not a bad development for Mary. George certainly had his flaws. However, he was also a man of duty and was devoted to his royal responsibilities. Their marriage was one of affection of a kind, though there was also a rather bizarre level of formality, even many years after they were married. Often, George would write his appreciation for her in letters, to which she responded stating that it was wonderful to hear about this in writing. However, she added that she also wouldn't mind if he simply told her in person that he valued her as his wife. They would have 6 children together. The eldest was a boy named Edward, the future King Edward VIII. He was born in the summer of 1894, less than 12 months after their wedding. Another boy named Albert, the future King George VI, followed in December 1895. Their only daughter, Mary, was born in April 1897, followed by Henry in 1900 and George in 1902. A final son, John, was born in 1905. As we will see, he suffered from poor health and would die just as he was entering his teenage years, whereas each of the other children lived into their adult years. Mary, George, and their young family lived between York Cottage on the Sandringham Royal Estate and York House in London. Their parenting style was not exactly modern. George was a strict disciplinarian, a trait he had picked up from his own father. One observer at the time noted that George, who had served in the Royal Navy in his younger years, seemed to run his family like a Navy captain trying to control a mutiny. While physically disciplining one's children was not unusual during the Victorian period and in early 20th century Europe, what was slightly more peculiar is that physical discipline was also used by their household staff in a way which was considered unusual by that time. George's distant nature did not lend itself to a warm family environment. Mary was closer to her children, and they often looked to her to temper their father's brutish parenting style. There was a kind of closeness there at the same time. When they embarked on a tour of various parts of the British Empire in 1901, Mary and George were upset by the idea of leaving their children behind for such a protracted period of time. They were criticised in later years because of the demise of their youngest child. Prince John was born in 1905. He began to suffer from epilepsy when he was just a few years old. This meant that he was often kept away from public events and London society. He did not, for instance, attend his parents' coronation in 1911. Instead, he lived at Sandringham, even when the wider family were in London. After 1913, he was almost never seen in public. This is because his condition was deteriorating, and he died eventually in 1919 from his seizures as they became more and more severe. Mary and George could be criticised for trying to hide John away from the public, but what else were they to do? Epilepsy was not well understood at the time, and exposing John to public ceremonies might have worsened his condition. It seems unfair to blame them for not being able to better address something they didn't fully understand. Mary's life in the 1890s and 1900s was one of frequent travel. Her husband liked life at Sandringham and the country pursuits that accompanied it, and he tried to spend time there as much as possible. Mary preferred the social life of London, and so they split their time between the two places when in England. They often travelled abroad. As we have seen, they went on an extended tour of the empire in 1901. This involved travel to Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They were only just back when Mary's first cousin, Queen Victoria, finally died after what was, at that time, the longest monarchical reign in British and English history. Victoria's reign of nearly 64 years had eclipsed George III's, and the reign of Victoria has become synonymous with the height of the British Empire. She died on the 22nd of January 1901 at 81 years of age. With this, her son Edward succeeded her as King Edward VII. He was already 59 years of age by that time and had lived a hard life that meant he was in poor health even as he finally became king after nearly 6 decades of being heir to the throne. What this meant is that George now became heir to the throne and could reasonably assume that he would be king before too long. He certainly would not be waiting around for the 59 years his father had been. Mary would in turn soon become Queen Consort. Beyond this, their changed status as Prince and Princess of Wales meant that the amount of royal engagements increased, as did their status during them. In 1905, they travelled to India, the British Raj, of which they would soon become Emperor and Empress. The following year, they visited Madrid for the wedding of Princess Ina of Battenberg to King Alfonso XIII of Spain. King Edward VII lasted until 1910, despite his poor health. He had been in decline for several years at that point, illness brought on by his chronic smoking and poor lifestyle over many years. In his final years, he suffered from bronchitis, is believed to have weighed over 20 stone, and had several heart attacks. He passed away on the 6th of May 1910 at 68 years of age. With this, Mary's husband immediately became king as King George V of the United Kingdom and also Emperor of India. Mary became Queen Consort of the UK and Empress of India. Although her first baptismal name was Victoria, she adopted the regnal name Mary, not only because she had gone by May instead of Mary to those who knew her for her entire life, but also out of deference to the legacy of her cousin, Queen Victoria. George and Mary's coronation did not take place until the 22nd of June 1911. It wasn't entirely unusual for a large period of time to elapse between the accession of a new monarch and the coronation. The 14 months in George's case was partly owing to the fact that Britain was mired in a constitutional crisis when he became king in the early summer of 1910, one brought about by the unprecedented decision of the House of Lords to block the People's Budget, a fiscal programme designed to redistribute wealth in Britain and introduce labour and social reforms. Only when that was resolved could planning for the coronation go ahead. It was a spectacular event in many ways, the last royal coronation before the First World War, and so the last time that many of the royal houses of Europe, like the Habsburgs, the Romanovs, and the Hohenzollerns, were still rulers of their nations as they arrived in London for a British coronation. Mary wore a cream-coloured coronation gown, which bore emblems representing Britain's empire, like the Star of India and a rose, thistle and shamrock to symbolise England, Scotland and Ireland. It was also the last coronation in England in which a monarch and consort would be crowned as rulers of a united Ireland under British rule. In a way, Mary and George had two coronations. As soon as the first one was over in England, the new King and Queen intensified the planning for the second one. It would take place on the other side of the world in India. The Delhi Durbar, or Court of Delhi as it was known, was held in the capital of the British Raj, the city of Delhi. It was the third Delhi Durbar. The first had been held back in 1877 to mark the occasion of Queen Victoria being given the title of Empress of India. She had not attended in person. A second Delhi Durbar was held in 1903 to celebrate the accession of Edward VII as Emperor of India 2 years earlier. Again, Edward did not attend. So when George and Mary sailed from Portsmouth on the 11th of November 1911 for India, they did so as the first King and Queen who were going to attend a Delhi Durbar in person. They arrived at Delhi 4 weeks later. The main event of the Delhi Durbar was held on the 12th of December 1911 at Coronation Park in Delhi. The British Raj had been formed out of many principalities and sultanates over a period of more than a century, and some of these indigenous lords retained a great status within British India. Therefore, the Durbar was an opportunity for thousands of Indian aristocrats and officials to formally acknowledge George and Mary as the Emperor and Empress of India. The following day, Mary and her husband appeared at the balcony of the Red Fort in Delhi, the historic seat of the Mughal emperors. There they waved to 500,000 people who had turned out to see their new rulers. After the Durbar, Mary and George proceeded on to Nepal. The whole state visit to India was filmed and released afterwards as a motion picture named With Our King and Queen Through India. After returning home, following the India trip and the Delhi Durbar, Mary's approach to being Queen Consort became more apparent to the British public. There were some differences that were noticed immediately. Edward VII and his consort, Queen Alexandra, had acted quite independently of one another. George and Mary quickly made it clear that they were a kind of team. Indeed, George looked to his wife for leadership on many issues. To put it bluntly, Mary was more intelligent than her husband and was also a lot more informed on social issues. She also mixed better with the public and royal staff, whereas George was at his most comfortable when engaging in his hobbies away from the limelight of London and the court. Simply put, Mary was better suited to being queen than he was to being king, and he relied heavily on her. She pushed him to engage more with a wide range of social issues. The 19th century had been a time of appalling labour practices. When children worked in factories, adult men were expected to work 70 or 80 hours a week, and urban poverty was endemic in some of the country's larger cities. By the 1910s, a great amount of work had been done to reform these issues, but there were still communities in England, in the very heart of the great British Empire, that were steeped in poverty. Mary encouraged George to take an interest in these issues. When a national strike was entered into by coal miners across Britain in 1912, the King and Queen visited the coal mines at Glamorgan in South Wales and other places. On the other hand, Mary was not exactly receptive to the militant suffragist movement that was campaigning for women to be given the right to vote in British elections. In 1913, She and George were present at the Epsom Derby when a suffragette, Emily Davison, ran out onto the track during the race in front of the King's horse, Anna. Davison was killed after being knocked down by the speeding horses. Though it seems strange in retrospect, militant action like this turned many people against the suffragist movement at the time. Mary's early years as Queen were marked by crisis after crisis in the political affairs of Europe. Things had been tense for many years already. Colonial rivalry, for instance, was a constant source of friction between the European powers, and back in the winter of 1898, the British and French had nearly ended up at war with each other over the Fashoda incident in the Sudan in Africa. Increasingly, though, the great rival was the German Empire, a power with which the British was locked in a naval arms race from the mid-1900s onwards. A strange development, as Germany could never hope to eclipse the British Royal Navy. Yet while there were many tensions between Britain and other countries, in the end, the thing which dragged the continent to war was a political assassination in the Balkans, which agitated the wider issue of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian Empire's efforts to acquire influence there as the Ottoman Empire's 4 centuries-long rule over the southeastern corner of Europe collapsed. As this occurred, there was a cascade of declarations of war in late July and early August 1914. The First World War was a peculiar family affair. Mary, like the rest of the royal family, had a lot of German heritage. Now Britain was at war with Germany. Indeed, her husband was the first cousin of Wilhelm II, Kaiser of the German Empire. He had the same relationship with Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, with whom the British were allied. There were many other royal links. Queen Marie of Romania, for instance, was another royal cousin, and prior to Mary marrying George, there had been a proposal that Marie would do so. Romania finally entered the war on the British side in 1916. These family affairs weighed heavily on the royals during the conflict that engulfed Europe in the mid-1910s. Mary believed that she had an important role to play in the war. In her diary, in early August, just days after Britain had joined the conflict, she noted the need to contribute to various relief schemes, like supporting the families of those young men who were now headed off to France to fight the Germans in the trenches, and to support the hospitals that would soon be caring for the hundreds of thousands of sick and wounded men. A lot of her activity early on centred on the Needlework Guild, renamed the Queen Mary Needlework Guild. Through her patronage, a small battalion of women set to work knitting various garments for charities and foundations like the Red Cross, the St John Ambulance and the National Relief Fund. A visitor to St James's Palace in 1915 would have seen mounds of packages waiting to be sent out. She also coordinated her efforts with various groups to ensure that women were employed on the home front while the men headed off to war. This led to the formation of a very unusual alliance with the secretary of the Women's Trade Union League, Mary MacArthur. They developed a close, almost friendly relationship as they coordinated their efforts in 1914 and 1915. This was highly unusual for the time. Trade unions were still viewed as dangerous instruments of socialism, and the royals were universally supporters of the established political parties, the Conservatives or Tories and the Liberals. Mary's workload increased dramatically overall during the war years. The royal staff later suggested she attended roughly 3 times as many engagements as was typical in peacetime. She also spearheaded the move to impose rationing and frugality amongst the royals. The royal family could not be seen to be continuing to live in luxury, while ordinary British people eked out an existence and sent their sons off to France to die. This was not out of the ordinary for Mary, who, despite being a royal and now a queen consort, was known for avoiding extravagance. Mary's service to the country was honoured in an unusual way after the war. She was gifted a doll's house by the nation. This wasn't any doll's house though. The idea for this came from Princess Marie-Louise of Schleswig-Holstein, a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a cousin of George and Mary. She was a few years younger than Mary, and they had grown up together and remained friends in their adult years. Marie-Louise believed Mary would enjoy an unusual decorative gift and that she should be honoured for her admirable service during the war. She contacted a well-known architect, Sir Edward Lutyens, and they began designing the doll's house in 1921 with the help of a committee. When this is described as a doll's house, it should be noted that it was much larger than the average doll's house. It was built on the scale of 1 inch to 1 foot, so the whole thing is over 1.5 meters high, 1 meter wide, and 66 centimeters deep, with rooms arranged over 4 floors, resembling an Edwardian manor. Over the next 3 years, hundreds of tradespeople worked on it, and artists and writers were employed to add artistic flair to the whole endeavour. An extraordinary level of detail is found throughout. For instance, tiny little books found on a bookshelf opened up to reveal miniature bits of writing by writers commissioned for the project. Miniature portrait paintings were painted of the king and queen and hung on the walls of the main salon, and extremely precise miniature cutlery adorned a table in the dining room downstairs. There was even a wine cellar with miniature bottles of wine and brandy that, if opened, contained a tiny amount of alcohol in each. Queen Mary's doll's house was presented to her in 1924, and the following year it was installed as the centrepiece of its own room in Windsor Castle, where it can be visited today. With the end of the war, some normality returned to royal life. At the same time, it was a tense period for royal families all over the continent. The Russian Revolution had seen the Romanov dynasty there overthrown and violently murdered. The Habsburgs, who had created the Austrian state as their family patrimony, had been overthrown, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire had fragmented into several countries. The German imperial family was gone, and the Kaiser was in exile in the Netherlands. Portugal had lost its monarchy in 1910, and Spain would follow suit in 1931. There seemed little chance that the constitutional monarchy would be overthrown in Britain, but there was a lot of unrest after the war, as men who had fought in the trenches of France for years returned to a country with high unemployment and growing support for the labour movement, as communist regimes emerged all across the continent. Faced with such a situation, the royals stepped up their efforts to engage with the British public in the 1920s. At Buckingham Palace, Mary's husband decided to keep a chart that chronicled the family's public engagements and work with the community. Mary was especially committed to this. She became a great patron of British hospitals in the 1920s and organisations which looked towards the welfare of children. The Royal Secretarial Staff wrote about the new mission, which was to reform the monarchy so that the royals appeared as individuals who didn't simply rule from on high at Buckingham Palace, but were committed to the betterment of the lives of the British people. To this end, Mary patronised a lot of projects which aimed to try and improve living standards within working-class communities. Her and George's efforts were not in vain. They have the unusual distinction that the monarchy was more popular at the end of the reign than it was at the beginning. Usually, it tended to work the other way around, with a burst of excitement for a new monarch and royal family at the start of a reign, and then a more nonchalant attitude developing over time, especially if a king or queen ruled for many, many years. Mary managed to oversee this work in the 1920s, despite an often difficult family environment. By then, their living children had all entered their adult years. In several instances, there were no problems. The second eldest son, Albert, was reserved and dutiful. He married early, and it was a good match with Lady Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon. He also started working to overcome a speech impediment which dented his confidence and impacted on his royal duties. Similarly, their eldest daughter, Princess Mary, married in 1922 to Henry Lascelles and was already a responsible member of the royal family by that time. She had, for instance, been the first member of the family to visit France after the armistice to end the First World War was agreed on the 11th of November 1918. Just 9 days later, Princess Mary was in France to visit wounded British soldiers in the field hospitals near the Western Front. While she and Albert were causes for pride in their parents, there were issues with the other children. Henry didn't marry, and instead began an affair with Beryl Markham, which began in Kenya in 1928 and continued back in London with alcohol-soaked parties at the Grosvenor Hotel. George, Duke of Kent, also did not marry young and was rumoured to have fathered an illegitimate child in the mid-1920s. But the gravest concern for the King and Queen was their eldest child, the Prince of Wales and heir to the throne, Edward. He did not marry, as his 20s and 30s came and went. The King's relationship became fraught with Edward as a result. By all accounts, Mary disassociated herself from the problem and never spoke to Edward about his relationships or his failure to marry and produce an heir. Once the lean years of the war and the post-war years ended and a new era of prosperity began in the mid-1920s, Mary devoted a lot of her time and attention to becoming a patron of the arts. The Queen had developed a great interest in art history in her youth after living for a while in France and spending time in its great galleries and museums. She had also absorbed this interest from her mother. But unlike her mother, Mary had the financial firepower to be able to indulge this interest in a very serious way. As Queen Consort, she began building up the Royal Art Collection, a collection assembled over centuries, which is the largest private art collection anywhere in the world today. Mary acquired many pieces over the years. A lot of these were portraits of any kind of the royal family, or some of the huge numbers of historical paintings that had been fashionable in the 19th century. It must be said that she didn't have a fantastic eye. Mary preferred quantity and not quality. Few works she acquired could compare with the masterworks acquired by monarchs like King Charles I and his son, King Charles II, in the 17th century. It was the son of that duo, for example, who acquired hundreds of drawings and sketches by Leonardo da Vinci, one of the jewels of the royal collection to this day. Not everything Mary acquired were paintings. For instance, she had an interest in jade statues, many from China, at a time when an interest in the Far East was abounding. The number of ornate Fabergé eggs in the royal collection was also increased by Mary. A large proportion of what she acquired was themed around birds. Elsewhere, she simply acted to reorganize and consolidate the existing collection. Several predecessors had not displayed much interest in the royal collection, and it needed some working on to organize it properly. Mary's husband was happy to leave her to this, even though Mary spent quite a lot of money on the work she acquired. He seems to have viewed her hobby as a parallel one to his interest in stamp collecting. Perhaps someone should have pointed out to him that paintings by Europe's master painters were generally a good deal more expensive than stamps. Mary's prolific collecting habits have led to accusations in modern times that she stole a sizable amount of the material that she added to the royal collection and was, in essence, a kleptomaniac, a compulsive stealer. For instance, she was portrayed in one recent television series stealing objects from the houses of members of the British aristocracy when visiting their homes. There is actually a large kernel of truth to this. As we have seen, Mary was a compulsive collector of all kinds of objects. Furthermore, she was known on occasion, when visiting the homes of others, to cast her eye on a particular object and express her liking for it, indicating that she would like to be gifted it. This does seem to have been with a view to having her obliging host let her have it. But the idea that the Queen of Britain and Empress of India was often found rummaging through the drawers of her dinner host's drawing room for objects to put in her purse is excessive. Mary was instead inclined to overly indulge a centuries-old practice whereby the royal family were given gifts by members of the aristocracy or people looking to curry favour with them. At the same time, these gifts were usually repaid in some way through various types of royal patronage. And in addition to this, it could be argued that where she acquired items for the royal collection, that she was not actually trying to acquire them for herself. The royal collection is owned by the Crown in trust for future generations. So it was not as though Mary's collecting habits were designed to benefit herself exclusively. There was arguably a different motive at work in Mary's compulsive collecting habits. Perhaps she was trying to distract herself from her husband's ailing health. In 1915, during the war, he fell from a horse while reviewing a division of troops in France. On top of this, he suffered from severe respiratory issues that were made worse by his chain smoking. By the 1920s, he was prematurely aged. His doctors prescribed rest and a healthier lifestyle to no avail. In 1928, he suffered a serious bout of illness, and he developed septicemia next to one of his lungs. From that point onwards, he was never in good health. George was often run down and energyless, and confined to bed for extended periods of time in the 1930s. Mary met this predicament with a stoic determination. She was self-controlled and didn't reveal her emotions to anyone. In fact, her lack of emotion led many to question what she was bottling up. An aggravating factor in all of this was that Edward was clearly not developing the kind of maturity and character needed to become king if George died soon. Mary's husband struggled on though. On the 6th of May 1935, he celebrated his Silver Jubilee, a quarter of a century as monarch, with Mary by his side. This was the first Silver Jubilee celebrated by a British monarch. The concept of a Golden Jubilee, marking 50 years on the throne, had been created back in the reign of George III, and Victoria had celebrated the same 50-year mark in 1887. There was a clear reason why a Silver Jubilee was marked for George V. There was no possibility he would reach his 50th year. In his speech, he gave fulsome praise to Mary as his consort. John St. Helier Lander painted individual portraits of King and Queen to mark the occasion. It was the last major act of the reign and of Mary's time as Queen Consort. George died 8 months later, on the 20th of January, 1936. His physician gave him a lethal injection of a cocktail of drugs to speed his death, as Mary's husband was in a great deal of suffering, an action which has aroused some controversy over the years. The death of Mary's husband was followed by a year of crisis. In line with royal norms, her eldest son succeeded as King Edward VIII. Edward had always been a problematic heir to the throne. He was a playboy who spent money lavishly during the 1920s and 1930s, and who socialised a lot. As we have seen, in his younger years, he refused to marry and settle down, something which caused a rift between him and his father in particular. It was the duty of a Prince of Wales and heir to the throne to marry and start a family, to ensure the continuity of the royal line. In refusing to do so, Edward was neglecting one of his primary duties. He turned 40 years in 1934, by which time he should have married. To his mother and father's consternation, it was becoming evident by then that Edward was determined to continue a relationship which he had begun with Wallis Simpson. She was an American socialite who had already been married and divorced once, and who was still married to her second husband, Ernest Simpson, when she became involved with Edward. The affair was still ongoing when Edward ascended to the throne early in 1936. The new king's refusal to end the affair led to the abdication crisis in the autumn of 1936. There were several things that were issues here that would not be concerns today, notably the fact that Wallis was a non-noble, and so this would constitute a morganatic marriage to a commoner if Edward went ahead and married Simpson. Her status as a divorcee and an American were also problematic, and so Britain was plunged into the abdication crisis just months into the new reign. Mary's attitude towards the developing crisis was complex. As she acclimatized to her new position as Queen Dowager, the former Queen Consort and widow of a deceased king, she remained abreast of the situation with Edward, receiving regular updates on what he was doing and what his next actions with regard to Simpson might be. She, like almost everyone else, was surprised during the spring and summer of 1936 as Edward did not end the relationship and dug his heels in. In the late summer, she was updated as photos were made available of Edward and Wallis holidaying in the Mediterranean, in Greece and Yugoslavia. When Edward returned home, he met his mother for dinner at Buckingham Palace in September, and 2 weeks later at a family gathering at Marlborough House. She is understood to have not pressed him during those meetings about what he ultimately intended to do. Many people appear to have been urging Mary to intervene more directly with her son before news of the scandal was made public by the British newspapers. What is most peculiar is that Mary was in touch with members of the government cabinet trying to block Wallis's divorce from her second husband. If she couldn't divorce Ernest, then she could not marry Edward. Yet Mary didn't raise these matters directly with Edward, pointing towards the distance between mother and son. The marriage issue became a full-blown crisis in November. It was only then that Mary intervened directly. She invited Edward for tea and implored him to consider his younger brother Albert's situation. He had not been brought up as the heir, and if the crisis resulted in Edward having to abdicate, Albert would suddenly be thrust into becoming king. In the end, that is exactly what happened. On the night of the 11th of December 1936, Edward abdicated in a BBC radio broadcast, and Albert succeeded as King George VI. Edward went on to marry Wallis Simpson. The pair led a peculiar life thereafter, much of it in Paris, and including a controversial visit to Nazi Germany in 1937. The abdication crisis meant that Mary could not adapt to life as Queen Dowager, the widow of a deceased king, immediately in 1936. It was only once Albert had become King George VI and the situation became more stable in 1937 that she was able to retire, as it were. She continued her work with various artistic institutions, though there was less pressure on her now that a new queen, her daughter-in-law, had taken up that position. As Queen Dowager, she enjoyed attending the theatre and various exhibitions and museums. She also became a frequent attendee at the Wimbledon Tennis Championships in London during the summers, a role she continued after the Second World War. In 1948, she presented the winners with their trophies. Mary had actually first established the ties between the royal family and the tournament at Wimbledon all the way back in 1906, when they attended as Prince and Princess of Wales. That link continues down to the present day, and since 2017, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has been the patron of the Lawn Tennis Association, which runs the championships at Wimbledon. Beyond this, Mary's first years as Queen Dowager involved spending more time with her grandchildren and a near-fatal car accident. In May 1939, when she was being driven through Putney in London with Lord Claude Hamilton and Lady Constance Milnes Gaskell, a truck that was carrying a large load of steel tubes overturned right next to the car Mary was in. The car was turned on its side, and the Queen Dowager eventually ended up being helped out using a ladder. It made national news, and the papers got a lot of coverage out of the fact that Mary was overheard to say that she needed a cup of tea right after extricating herself from the crashed vehicle. Mary's involvement with Wimbledon had a curious link to developments on the continent. In 1935, 1936 and 1937, the runner-up each year in the men's singles tournament was Gottfried von Cramm, a German who won the French Open, another of the Grand Slam tennis tournaments, on 2 occasions in 1934 and 1936. Von Cramm might have been forced to play under the flag of Nazi Germany, and the regime exploited his successes in London and Paris to the greatest extent it could. But von Cramm was no supporter of Nazism and refused to join the Nazi Party, despite being pressured to do so. His appearance in the Wimbledon finals came in years when anxiety about his nation's actions was growing in England. Mary was just as aware of this as anyone else. Like the rest of the royal family, she was perturbed when Edward and Wallis Simpson decided to visit Germany and meet the Nazi leadership a year after his abdication in a much publicised event which the British government and the royal family made clear was not an official state visit of any kind. It became especially controversial when the Nazis began the speedy race to war in the months that followed, annexing Austria and Czechoslovakia before the war broke out following their invasion of Poland in September 1939. The elderly and children were evacuated from London for much of the war, particularly so once the German Blitz, the bombing campaign, began in the autumn of 1940. Mary spent much of the conflict at Badminton in Gloucestershire. She continued her royal duties, visiting hospitals and also meeting groups of children and others who had been evacuated from London to the countryside. The Queen Dowager also spent much of the war busying her hands by knitting an elaborate carpet. After the war, it was sold to a women's organisation in Canada for the huge sum of £100,000. Mary donated the money to the British Exchequer, which badly needed it after a financially ruinous conflict. The Second World War came to an end in Europe in May 1945, though it would continue against Japan in the Far East for another 4 months. Mary was in her late 70s by the time it ended. In the years that followed, she would be a witness to all of the old truths about Britain and its role in the world beginning to crumble. The British Empire had already been in decline prior to the war. Much of this was based on the demographic realities of the United Kingdom. This was a small country with a limited population on the periphery of Europe. Its ascent as the world's superpower in the 19th century was based on the technological advantages it acquired as a result of the scientific and industrial revolutions, the dynamism of the British people, and the power of the British Royal Navy. By the early 20th century, as the technologies which Britain and other European nations had developed spread around the world, it became more and more difficult to retain control over vast parts of the globe and huge populations. Moreover, although Britain was an imperial power, the political classes were receptive to calls for self-determination within different parts of the empire. In the aftermath of the war, it began to dismantle its empire. The speed with which it did so was surprising. In 1947, Mary watched as independence was granted to the British Raj, where she and George had celebrated the Delhi Durbar back in 1911. Unfortunately, it descended into religious violence in the process between Muslims and Hindus, and 2 major nations, Muslim Pakistan and Hindu India, emerged. All across Africa, there were calls for independence in colonies like Nigeria and Kenya. Mary would not live long enough to see these claims realised in most countries, though she did witness the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 and the end of British involvement in Cairo's affairs. On the domestic front, Mary continued to contribute to the activities of the royal family, even though she was now in her late 70s and ageing. She was not a fan of the Labour government which came to power within weeks of the end of the Second World War in Europe, ousting Winston Churchill's administration despite his immensely successful wartime leadership. Mary was, for instance, opposed to the plans to set up a National Health Service as a cornerstone of the new welfare state, which was planned to avoid any future descent into extremist politics, such as had brought the Nazis to power in Germany in the midst of the Great Depression. It was not that she was opposed to the very concept of ready access to healthcare for the less affluent in society. Mary simply believed that this could best be achieved through charitable activity rather than the state becoming involved to manage it. This was in keeping with her outlook as Queen Consort in the 1910s, 1920s and 1930s that the new modern monarchy should be an instrument of welfare and charity. There were personal worries and tragedies for her as well during these years. Mary had buried one son when John died in childhood, all the way back in 1919. In 1942, she had buried a second, when George, Duke of Kent, not to be confused with his brother Albert, who adopted George as his regnal name, was killed in a plane crash near Dunbeath in Scotland. After the war, King George VI became prematurely unwell. Like his grandfather and father before him, he was suffering from severe respiratory problems that were worsened by his chain-smoking. After years of ill health, he died on the 6th of February, 1952. Mary was one of the first to kiss the hand of her granddaughter and recognise her as Queen Elizabeth II. Mary's own health was failing by the time Elizabeth ascended to the throne. She would not live long enough to see her granddaughter crowned. The coronation was scheduled for the 2nd of June 1953. As the months went by after George's death, it became more likely that his mother would not live to see the new queen crowned. Mary turned 85 in May 1952, a ripe old age in the mid-20th century, when life expectancies, even for those with access to the best healthcare available, was a few years less than it is today. She was suffering from a range of health issues, foremost amongst which was a gastric stomach problem. Mary also seemed to have lost some of her drive to live longer, having been affected by burying the third of her children. By early 1953, she was largely confined to bed, rarely rose out of it, and complained of having the curtains opened in her final residence, Marlborough House, in London, as the light impacted on her eyes. She suffered a hemorrhage early on the 24th of March. Things declined rapidly in the hours that followed, and an announcement by the royal establishment that she was gravely ill was followed within hours by another that she had passed away peacefully in her sleep not long after 10 p.m. An autopsy subsequently revealed that lung cancer had contributed to her death. The following day, Winston Churchill, back serving as Prime Minister, stated that with her passing, the last major link to the glory days of Queen Victoria had passed from the world. The former Queen's remains lay in state for several days afterwards, as visiting European dignitaries and hundreds of thousands of British people came to pay their respects. The official funeral was held at St George's Chapel at Windsor on the 31st of March 1953, after which her remains were interred in the royal crypt alongside her husband, who had lain there for 17 years. At the same time, a memorial service was held at St Paul's Cathedral in London for the mourners there. Mary's legacy and memory lives on in Britain today and beyond its shores across the former parts of the empire. Her name, for instance, is attached to one of Britain's most eminent colleges. On the 25th of February 1931, a fire had destroyed the Queen's Hall of East London College. A new site was chosen to replace the building next to the People's Palace. Various names were proposed for the site, including the generic Queen's College and Victoria College. In the end, the name Queen Mary College was chosen, and Mary herself presented the formal Charter of Incorporation when the building work was completed in 1934. Hence, one of London's leading educational establishments is not actually named after Queen Mary I or Queen Mary II, as many people often assume, but the Queen Consort, Mary of Teck. On the other side of the world, Queen Mary College in Lahore, in Pakistan, is also named after her. There are many other buildings and institutions which similarly bear her name. The wife of George V has also featured in numerous books, plays, films, and television series. Several of these focused on the abdication crisis. Miranda Richardson depicted her in a sympathetic manner in The Lost Prince, a series on the more obscure story of Prince John and his death as a child. Claire Bloom played Mary in The King's Speech, the story of her son, Albert's speech impediment, and how he overcame it to become King George VI and Britain's wartime king. Eileen Atkins has the peculiar distinction of having played Mary twice in two different productions, in 2002 in Bertie and Elizabeth, and more recently in The Crown. Mary of Teck's life and time as Queen Consort were very surprising in some respects. When she was born back in 1867 as the daughter of a second-tier branch of the British royal family, her parents and most others that knew her assumed that she would marry an important duke or minor prince and head off to the continent to live out a comfortable life in Germany or the Balkans or some other country. The trajectory of her life was changed when her cousin, Queen Victoria, decided that she should instead marry her grandson, the second in line to the throne, Albert Victor. When he died before that union could come about, Mary was instead married to Albert's replacement in the line of succession, George. From there it was a steady ascent to become Duchess of York in 1893, then Princess of Wales in 1901, and finally Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India in 1910. She held those positions for just over a quarter of a century, through the First World War, the triumph of Britain in its aftermath, and the steady decline of empire that was already setting in during the 1920s and 1930s. She was a modern kind of queen, who devoted a lot of her energy to charitable causes and to making a connection between the royal family and the common people of Britain. Behind closed doors, her family life was complex. She and George loved their children, but George was old-fashioned and a disciplinarian. The children looked to Mary for a gentler form of parenting. The relationships were often strained, especially so with Edward, who refused to marry and lived a playboy lifestyle instead, despite being the next in line to the throne. In the end, the death of Mary's husband in 1936 set off an abdication crisis, which probably ended well for all involved when Albert soon became king as George VI. Mary's later years were lived against the backdrop of another world war and then the post-war reconstruction of Britain. It was a very different world that mourned her passing in 1953 than the one she was born into 86 years earlier. Mary was one of the key figures in ensuring the monarchy navigated those changes successfully. What do you think of Mary of Teck? Should she be seen as a respectable member of the royal family? Or do recent revelations about her alleged kleptomania cast her in a different light? Please let us know in the comment section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.